By 1985, interest rates had hit 21.5%. One-third of all American farmers held nearly two-thirds of the nation's total farm debt. Lenders were collapsing, main streets were closing, families were packing up and driving away from land that had been in their names for generations. Most of them made the same decisions. They waited too long, they trusted the market would turn. They didn't talk to anyone until it was too late. But the farms that survived, they made different decisions. 7 of them, to be exact. Not 7 lucky breaks, not 7 government bailouts. 7 choices, made by ordinary people, with their backs against a wall, and everything they loved on the line. These are the 7 decisions that saved American family farms. Decision number 1: they talked to their spouse first, before they called the bank, before they called a lawyer, before they told a single neighbor. The farmers who survived talked to their families. It sounds simple. It wasn't. In the culture of rural America in the 1980s, financial trouble was private. A man didn't advertise that his operation was struggling. He carried it alone. And that silence, that pride, destroyed more farms than any interest rate ever did. An agricultural economist who worked through the crisis later said it plainly: the top priority for surviving the cycle was communication. First with your spouse, then with your lender. The farmers who sat down at the kitchen table and spread out every piece of paper they owned, the ones who said out loud what was happening, were the ones who could start solving it. Because you cannot fix what you will not name. Decision number 2: they pivoted before they were forced to. There were 2 kinds of farmers in the 1980s. The ones who changed because they chose to, and the ones who changed because the bank made them. The difference in outcome between those 2 groups was everything. A farmer who sells his extra equipment in 1983 gets fair market value. A farmer whose equipment gets auctioned off in 1985 gets whatever the crowd is willing to pay, which sometimes, as we've seen, was $5.35. The farmers who survived looked at their operation early, before the crisis hit its worst, and made hard choices voluntarily. They sold land they couldn't make profitable. They cut back on inputs. They tried a new crop before the old one failed completely. The decision to change before you're forced to is one of the hardest things a human being can do, especially when the thing you're changing is something you inherited from your father. But the farms that made it were the ones whose owners chose the moment, not the bank. Decision number 3: they filed Chapter 12. In 1986, Congress passed the Family Farmer Bankruptcy Act. Chapter 12 of the Bankruptcy Code was designed specifically for family farms in financial distress. It allowed farmers to reduce their debt burdens to current asset values, which, by the mid-1980s, were a fraction of what they'd borrowed against. It reduced interest rates dramatically. It stretched repayment schedules out over years. Nearly every case filed under Chapter 12 succeeded. Farmers kept their land, their debts were restructured, and the subsequent rebound in farmland values meant that the plans were not just survivable, they were eventually profitable. But here's what mattered most. The farmers who filed Chapter 12 made that decision themselves. They didn't wait for the bank to foreclose. They didn't wait for the sheriff's sale. They walked into a lawyer's office, often a rural attorney working out of a room above a barber shop, and they said, "I need help." That decision to ask for help, before it was too late, saved more family farms than any other single act of law in that decade. Decision number 4: they sold what they didn't need. A 1967 Farmall 560, a Case 970, a pair of grain bins that hadn't been used in 3 years. For many farmers, the equipment in their shed represented something deeper than machinery. It was proof of what they'd built, a record of every good year, the physical evidence of a farm that had once been expanding. Letting go of it felt like admitting defeat. The farmers who survived were the ones who let go anyway, not of everything, but of what they didn't need. They sold equipment. They sold timber rights. They sold a parcel of ground on the south end of the farm that hadn't pulled its weight in a decade. They turned those assets into cash before the bank turned them into a line item on a foreclosure notice. It wasn't pretty. Some of those machines sold for less than they were worth, but the farms those machines came from are still in the same family today. Decision number 5: they called their neighbors. The farm crisis of the 1980s did something that no agricultural crisis before it had done quite the same way. It organized people, farmers who had spent their whole lives working alone, competing quietly, keeping their troubles to themselves, started showing up for each other at auction blocks with their arms crossed and their bids low, at state capitol buildings with their boots on the marble floors, at kitchen tables in other people's farmhouses, with coffee and legal documents and the kind of knowledge that comes from having been through it yourself. An agricultural advocate who worked through the crisis said it directly. We've become specialized and we're off doing our thing. And suddenly we have a crisis and we need each other. We need to have that network again. We need to know each other again. The farmers who survived the 1980s knew their neighbors, not just as faces at the feed store, as people who would stand next to them when everything was on the line. Decision number 6. They went around the system. The commodity market was broken. The elevator was paying prices that couldn't cover the cost of what it took to grow the crop. The farmers who kept waiting for the elevator price to recover kept losing ground. The ones who survived found someone to sell to directly, a farmer's market in the city 30 miles away that was just beginning to fill with customers who wanted to know where their food came from, a restaurant in Des Moines that was willing to pay twice the commodity price for tomatoes they could put a name to, a family in town willing to drive to the farm every week for raw milk at $2.20 a gallon, when the store charged $1.89. Every customer they found directly was a dollar that didn't go through a system that was failing them. It wasn't enough to replace the commodity income entirely, but it was enough to make the difference between a farm that closed and a farm that didn't. Decision number 7. They stayed. This is the hardest one to explain, because by every rational measurement, every number on every piece of paper, the right decision for most of these families was to leave, take what you could get, let the bank have it, start over somewhere easier, and many did. Nobody who made that choice should be judged for it. The ones who stayed, they chose something that didn't make sense on paper. They chose to believe that the land was worth more than what the market said it was worth, that the work their parents had done, and their grandparents before them, meant something that couldn't be captured in a debt-to-asset ratio, that the ground would come back, that they would come back with it. Some of them were wrong, but the ones who were right, the ones who held on and restructured and pivoted and organized, and sold what they had to sell, and planted what they'd never planted before, they are still there. Their names are still on the mailboxes, and the land is still in the family, because at some point they made a decision that no bank could make for them. They decided it was worth fighting for. 7 decisions. None of them guaranteed anything. All of them required something most people find hardest to give: the willingness to act. Before you know how the story ends, the farm crisis changed rural America permanently. Towns that lost their farms never fully recovered. Banks that lent on them closed and didn't reopen, but the families that came through it left behind more than land. They left behind a record of what it looks like to make a decision when the stakes are everything you have. New stories every week on Deep Furrow.